wish to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure for me indeed to be here today. I will speak about the chances of democratic responses to the Romanian-Hungarian dispute, and in brief, my position is that, in my view, given the highly instrumental nature of several aspects of the Romanian-Hungarian dispute in the yet unfinished nation-building projects of both nations, I believe that new generations educated in significantly different spirit would be required in order to make this democratic responses possible. My presentation is structured in the following way. I will speak most of the time about the Romanian-Hungarian dispute. I will try to define it, to make it studyable, so to say. Then very briefly I'm going to go through two typologies which will help us to go to the conclusions which I would like to reach by presenting a possible solution which I see, which unfortunately is not of interest for any essential political actors so far. Now, the question is there a Romanian-Hungarian dispute at all? Of course, those who are familiar with what is going on in Romania today and the past couple of weeks, this would seem a rhetorical question mostly. Still, if we look at different perspectives, at different disciplines and different descriptions of the recent past, we will see quite nuanced or quite complementary answers to this question, if there is a dispute, and if it is, what it is about, what it is related to. So I'm going to present very briefly, or not that briefly, a few perspectives. First of all, of course, there is a historian or historical aspect of this dispute. Then there is a very, very interesting, less known reflection of the dispute in IR theory, which I find quite interesting because it yields quite important conclusions which I'm interested in personally. Then there is a very interesting account of the recent past, which is a bit contradictory to what we will see earlier. And finally, we will see what sociological studies say us about what we can think of in terms of the Romanian-Hungarian dispute. Now, in terms of the historians, of course, most those people who are aware of the Romanian-Hungarian relationships, there is a controversy among historians regarding the Romanian ethnogenesis and the history of Transylvania, which essentially breaks down to the question, who was here first? That is a question, and Romanians, Hungarians, particularly historians, regularly have very, very different perspectives on that. Important moments of this controversy are reflected on this slide very briefly. The story started in 1960-61 when on the Romanian side official history of Transylvania was published. That was a very important moment for the Romanian historiography. That was practically part of the Romanian nation-building project when an official position on that issue has been elaborated in great details. It's amazingly interesting that the Hungarian Academy immediately protested. The person who protested was president at that time, Kossuth Domokos, who said that the gesture of the Romanian nationalism, as he labeled it, will have a negative impact on the Romanian-Hungarian relationships. It is very interesting that later on, in 1986, sorry, Köpeci, I was wrong, it was not Kossuth, Köpeci Béla was there. Okay. And Köpeci Béla was the editor of the Hungarian version of the History of Transylvania, which was published in 1986 in 3 very representative volumes, which were, so to say, counter-response to what was published earlier by the Romanians. And it was very interesting that immediately in 1987 the Romanian authorities protested officially, including the president of the country at that time, and condemned the book. It was quite a heated period of Romanian-Hungarian recent diplomatic relations. And even more, the issue got a so-called international dimension in the Times. There was a paid announcement published in 1987, which was entitled "The Conscientious Forgery of History of Transylvania" under the aegis of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. The last and most recent phase of this debate is ongoing these days. There is an interesting debate regarding the textbook, which was published not very long time ago, about part of the Hungarian community in Transylvania, the settlers, and the history is, well, still an issue of debate among Romanian and Hungarian historians, and this debate is going on. I would say that in a quite promising way, because the two positions, though they are sustaining completely different positions, the dialogue is quite constructive, I would say. Now, moving on to the IR theory perspective very quickly, I would start by this interesting moment. In 1990, an important representative of the neo-realist school of IR theory, John Mearsheimer, published an article in which this quote was found. He warned about the serious tensions that now exist between Romania and Hungary over the Romanian treatment of the Hungarian minority in Pennsylvania, a region that previously belonged to Hungary and still has roughly 2 million ethnic Hungarians. Were it not for the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe, this conflict could have brought Romania to Hungary by war now, and it may bring them to war in the near future. Yes, it is hard to imagine that such a warning was issued in early 1990, but as I said, on the level of IR theory, this statement has been formulated. It is even more interesting that John Mearsheimer was not alone with this quite alarming warning. There were several statements in the international literature which were saying that the Romanian-Hungarian dispute is the most dangerous interstate problem in Europe, or Trevor Dupuy, that is an important book which was published in 1993 about future wars, the world's most dangerous flashpoints, which included the Romanian-Hungarian border zone. And then in the press, in the daily press, also references were made to this issue. Humphrey said that the Balkan-style ethnic tension is in Transylvania, or Tony Barber in The Independent warned that a tragedy is waiting to happen in Transylvania. It is interesting to ask what were the arguments behind these warnings. Of course, the neo-realist school is based on the assumption that bipolarity is more stable than multipolarity, and John Mearsheimer was very preoccupied by the fact that the Eastern hegemon disappeared, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Western hegemon was reluctant to extend its security guarantees to the region, and due to that he said that these conflicts which were in the background of this region and which were kept under control by the Eastern hegemon will inevitably come to the fore. Of course, there are also regional level arguments. Yes, there were things which were observed by the international observers. Joseph Antal, Prime Minister of the time of the Hungary, made a statement which was published in the New York Times saying that a European solution is needed for the Romania's treatment of Hungarians in Transylvania, which is an internationalizing of the problem. So he was asking for intervention, as a matter of fact, in the issue. The Hungarian government made a public statement saying that the defense of Hungarians beyond the borders of Hungary is a Hungarian nation's security issue, which was also an alarming statement for international actors. And also the fact that Hungary just got a significant military armament in '93 remained not unobserved by this analysts. Of course, a significant, an important source of this preoccupation for what's going on to happen in Transylvania was also traced back to what happened in March 1990 in Turgumurás-Marosvásárhely. It was what Humphrey was referring to, the Balkan style of ethnic tension, or even the potential of savage violence. Those who are not very familiar with the stories, that was the only violent, so to say, piece of history in Romania after 1989. That was a clash, an ethnic clash in the city, which was half and half between Romanians and Hungarians. The violence leaving 6 dead and 130-something injured persons. Now, of course, John Mearsheimer was not completely wrong. Yes, in his assumption that bipolarity or the sudden leaving behind of bipolarity and not extending Western guarantees for the region could lead to war was effectively true. Yes, we all know that the war happened effectively in the Balkans, but it didn't happen in the Romanian-Hungarian relationship. As a matter of fact, completely different thing happened. If we look at what was going on in the early 90s, we see very, very interesting developments while political tensions were reaching high peaks. Yes, behind that we saw interesting forms of military cooperation as early as in 1991, an open sky agreement, joint military exercises, hotline between the chief staff, military staff. In 1992, foreign ministry officials start to elaborate a basic bilateral treaty. This treaty is not signed for a long period of time, and the signing is delayed for several reasons. I may come back to that shortly, immediately. But finally, it is signed in September 1996, a moment which is celebrated by both countries' authorities as a historical reconciliation. Then in 1997, there is a first visit of a prime minister, Romanian prime minister, to Budapest. The same thing happens later on. Then free trade agreement enters into force, and Hungary becomes Romania's most important trading partner from the neighbors. And what is even more interesting, that starting with 2005, joint meetings of the two governments happened, and 5 such meetings are organized in the following 3 or 4 years, which is quite a spectacular development. You can imagine that all members of the Romanian government go to Bucharest and they have a joint meeting there, and all members of the Romanian government go to Budapest and have a joint meeting there. So this is quite a spectacular development as compared to what was happening earlier. Now, going back just for a moment to IR theory, I would like to say that this strange forecast of John Mearsheimer, which turned out to be completely wrong, of course became an issue for some authors who discovered this discrepancy between the forecast and reality, and they tried to give explanations of what has effectively happened. And I found 3 very interesting articles in the literature which give different perspectives, very, very different perspectives to what has effectively happened. Very shortly, I would like to say that there is an article written by Linden who says that essentially it was the Euro-Atlantic structures which made the 2 states to behave in a chameleonic way, in the sense that when the criteria for NATO accession were listed, the 2 countries realized that in order to be acceptable for NATO, they need to sign the agreement, and that is what effectively happened in 1996. And that was, so to say, a 2-level game, in the sense that the elites who have done this step could not secure popular support for this movement, but they still took this decision in the name of the countries they represented, and the result was that in the next elections in both countries they lost elections, because for what they did, the popular support was lacking effectively. Yordaki is giving a very interesting explanation. First of all, he uses a term, the security complex term in IR theory, and they say that it was a little bit more than chameleonic behavior on the side of the 2 states. They effectively discovered that the security cannot be imagined separately, so they all need, both states need to be in the structures of the NATO in order to reach security. But what is extremely important for what I'm going to conclude, in Yordaki's paper, there are 2 important statements. Once he mentions the fact that signing the bilateral treaty in September 1996 became possible due to a very, very interesting succession of events. The signing of the treaty on the side of the Hungarians were delayed for a long period of time because the Hungarians wanted to include in this treaty the guarantee of collective rights and the guarantee of collective protection of Hungarians in Romania, a requirement which was very consequently refused by the Romanian authorities. The Hungarian authorities tried to push that, and in July 4, 1996, the Hungarian state officials made a public announcement that they go for that and they want to have a guarantee for collective rights in the statement. And very soon after, July 29, Nicholas Burns, who was the State Department spokesperson, made a statement saying that no ethnic autonomy is supported by the US autonomies, and this statement triggered practically what was following. Gyula Horn, the Prime Minister of Hungary, immediately said that Hungary is ready to sign the bilateral treaty, and it effectively happened in less than a month. Okay, the last thing is just a curiosity. The same issue is addressed by Milton O'Neill in 2002, and the same interesting thing, which I think explains what happened. If we go back a little bit to this, if we go back to this chart, and we see that while politicians were debating very intensively, military and foreign ministry officials work very strongly in background cooperations. Practically, Milton O'Neill says that what we see in the Romanian-Hungarian relationship is the achievement of self-interested bureaucrats who have been coming from the pre-1989 times, and so we can say that it is not a liberal peace which was created in the Romanian-Hungarian relationship, but it was a conservative peace which were created. Okay, now moving on quickly to the sociological research, we again see a very different image of what we have seen so far. Rogers Brubaker, I'm sure the name is familiar to most of you, made a study about the Romanian-Hungarian relationships, and the book was published in 2006, in which he reached the following conclusion, that while there is a very deeply rooted contention between Romanians and Hungarians, the patterns of everyday ethnicity are largely peaceful. And he gives two explanations for that. That say that, first of all, the peace which we see on the level of Romanian-Hungarian relationships is due to a mutual agreement of systematically avoiding any sincere debate on what is going on. And Romanians and Hungarians, as far as they respect this arrangement, can live along quite peacefully. And this research has even identified, in a very interesting way, everyday coping strategies, how people effectively make this agreement, this tacit agreement, functional. There are teasing, joking, other things by which practically the peace is sustained. Of course, the conclusion is quite alarming. That says, if you look carefully, if you read carefully the text, that there is a peace which has no basis at all. It has no social basis. It is a peace which is based on the fact of avoiding discussing the things which we have not settled. Okay. Now, there are many sociological researches which yield very different perspectives on Romanians and Hungarians on issues which relate practically their mutual relationships. I've shown here just one. You can see that Romanians, Hungarians had very different options regarding issues, what the Romanian state, Hungarian state should do with ethnic Hungarians. I'm always showing this picture because it is interesting that there is one issue on which there is agreement. You can see it, that Hungary will never give up its claims over Transylvania. That is the only thing in which Romanians and Hungarians seem to agree. Of course, that is more of kind of a joke, because that is just showing an element of this debate which is still in the public discourse. Now, that is a quite recent one, which was conducted in the past couple of weeks, actually days, and which was trying to reflect the impact of the recent debates on the flags, on the Hungarian celebration in March 15 and other things. I cannot go into the details. I consider that it is still an important indicator that there are unsettled issues, and the level of acceptance between Romanians and Hungarians is quite unbalanced yet. There are things, important things to talk about. This tendency between 2002 and 2013, these two researches which I'm making reference to have been confirmed by several researches conducted by several methodologies. Essentially, we can say that most of the researches provide quite clear evidence that both in the case of Romanians and both in the case of the Hungarians, the percentage of persons who are socialized in a way which makes the mutual acceptance possible is very low, is below 10%, which I think is a considerable indicator of the problems we have. A particular element of this sociological research is provided by the researches which reflect the problem of the level of the youth. Yes, the British Council, amazingly in an interesting way, the British Council is interested in this problem. They have initiated two researches in 2004 and 2006 about values of the Romanian youth, aged between 15-25 and 15-35, and they found quite alarming elements of these problems. And there is a quote here which I would like to read, because this quote is in the press, Romania, yesterday and today, due to the fact that in this area populated mainly by Hungarians in Covasna County, there was a very, so to say, okay, I jumped between this, I jumped over this phrase I wanted to say here. So the Hungarian celebration of the National Day was extremely, so to say, spectacular, and within this spectacular celebration, in a high school, a Romanian girl decided to wear a scarf or a symbol, the Romanian symbols, yes, which was, so to say, by the day of the Hungarian National Day celebration, an act of bravery. And the way how the local community reacted to it was, in a way, in my way, quite telling in terms of what the problem is. This young girl became a national hero. Yesterday there were demonstrations across Transylvania supporting her for the act of bravery she has done. And interviews were taken. And one of the declarations she made in this interview is a quote I have here. She says, "I hate Hungarians. This is the truth. I detest them without looking for reasons. I cannot explain. There is something in me. It is a refusal. They irritate me. It could be genetic. My father was the same. When you see the level of discrimination in school, how much injustice, how many things are ignored by them, I simply cannot feel otherwise." That is a quote of a young high school lady today. I think it is quite telling, the problem we have. The quote, or I think there is much sincerity in the words we read, and I think a lot of attention needs to be given to this work, which is unfortunately not happening today. So I have to stop here, but we could come back to that. Now, I would sum up regarding the problem. So I started with a question if we have a problem, if we have a dispute or not. I think we do have one, and these are the two aspects which reflect the nature of it. On the one hand, we have an unsettled historical dispute, which is largely to the fact, to the image we have there. This is a map which was provided by the Stratfor Agency of Political Analysis at one point when the debate got heated not long ago. And I consider that the problem is that since neither of the two nation-building projects is finished and complete, to quote Linklater here again, a representative of the British School of Higher Theory, the Hungarian nation-building project is not finished because it couldn't cope yet with the Trianon trauma. Yes, there is a long history why it didn't, but still it is a problem which keeps people preoccupied, and there is not an issue settled in this case. On the other hand, the Romanian nation building project is not complete because of this red dot in the heart of Romania, which is a territory populated in a quite significant concentration by Hungarians. The Romanian society in the 1930s has been significantly diverse. It had a significant Jewish and German population which disappeared. The question is, what will happen with the Hungarians? The Hungarians need to, the Hungarian problem needs to be handled in the same way in order to finish the Romanian nation building project, or there are alternatives. Now, the second part of the problem is exactly what are these alternatives. I think there is no agreement what could be the solution for the problems we have, what could be the solutions which could provide comfort and security for Romanians, and at the same time guarantee of survival for the Hungarians, because we have to mention here that the Hungarian community is rapidly shrinking. In the past 20 years, 400,000 members disappeared. That is a very, very alarming number. And the forecast says that by 2020-23, they will be less than 1 million. Yes? So I think that a community which is shrinking at that dimension is becoming agitated. It's becoming mobilized, more and more evident. Now, I jump to the conclusions, and I hope to finish soon. In trying to look for solutions, I would like to have a quick look on this table which is summarizing the dispute settlement instruments which are available in the international literature. Since we live in an area where states and nations do not coincide, any type of solution has to give an answer to these two aspects. What to think of about the state building project and in which way to consider the nation building strategies. And we see that with these dimensions, which I cannot explain in details now, there are those options which are empirical options, which you will find in the recent history. We have given a couple of examples there, which are of course not. So I have shown in blue the options which are more close to the Romanian intentions, and I've shown in green the options which would be on the side of the Hungarian communities in Romania. And I'm now talking about how this red dot in the middle of Romania could be handled. Yes, that is a question we are talking about. Of course, Romania would rather see assimilation or emigration expulsion as an option. Yes, Hungarians would see or autonomy, territorial autonomy, or an ethnocultural balance. What would that mean? It is a little bit more difficult. I cannot go into details now. So that is one evidence of the problems of the debate which we have. A second would be, if we would think this conference is focusing on democracy, so I consider that that would be an interesting thing to talk about briefly. If we think about a typology of democratic arrangements which try to reflect diversity across the world, we see this picture. In the middle we have liberal democracy, which of course Michael Mann, a famous author who published recently a book, The Dark Side of Democracy, has very convincingly argued that liberal democracy practically became possible due to ethnic cleansing in the western part of the world. And there are two types of moving away from liberal democracy. One is this side, the other is that side. Again, by blue and green, I try to symbolize the options which would be available. I think that due to this menace which the Hungarian claims represent for the Romanian stability, Romania is moving to the ethnic democracy option, which essentially is a democracy in which a core nation is mobilizing its members against a menace which is present within the boundaries of the state. Yes. The alternatives would be multinational or consociational democracy, which in a way or other refer to what we can see here. That is an image which back in Romania we see quite often as how Romanians see the alternative of any kind of power sharing or ethnocultural balance based on ethnic criteria. And finally, I jump to the solution which I am advocating for. So what we have seen so far is clear enough, I believe, that in both cases, both in Romania and Hungary, both in the case of the Romanian and Hungarian nation-building projects, core elements of the conflict are so instrumental that we cannot expect that the actors today could afford to give them up. For that reason, what I believe the solution could be is to follow the example of the French-German Youth Institute, which was created in 1963 as a consequence of the Élysée Treaty, which was signed in the same year. This OFAGE, Office Franco-Allemagne pour la Jeunesse, was created. In 2003, 40 years of activity was celebrated, and this data was provided there. Throughout the 40 years of activity, more than 200,000 events were organized, which was trying to bring the two people closer, especially young. 7 million people participated in those events. 1,080 twinnings between cities, 4,000 between schools, 1,000 between universities were created, the Arte TV channel, and what is most important, after 40 years of a tremendous amount of work and effort, the two countries now are providing history education based, a jointly elaborated history textbook that was mentioned earlier, that some similar attempts are happening in Slovakia and the Romanian, in the Hungarian-Slovakian context. So that is what I believe that could be considered a model for looking for democratic solutions to the problems we have in between Romania and Hungary. Thank you for